More than a third of voters are not convinced the UK will leave the EU despite last week's referendum result, a poll for BBC Newsnight suggests. Britain voted by a margin of 52% to 48% to leave the EU after 43 years, and the contenders to replace David Cameron as PM have all vowed make it happen. But 22% of people polled for Newsnight said they don't know if it will, while 16% believe the UK will stay in the EU. Ipsos MORI interviewed 1,077 people between Wednesday and Thursday. The poll also suggests almost half of voters, 48%, agree there should be a general election before Britain begins Brexit negotiations so that people can vote on plans for life outside the EU. It comes after US Secretary of State John Kerry suggested the UK might not follow through with its decision to leave. Not confident. The vast majority of those interviewed said they would not change their vote if the UK held a second referendum on EU membership. But 5% of Leave voters said they would now change their vote compared to just 2% of Remain voters. Results also show that more than half of voters do not believe their current government and MPs reflect the views of the British public towards the EU, including 67% of Leave voters. And 59% of respondents said they were not confident in Britain's political leaders to get the best possible terms for Britain, rising to 76% of Remain voters. Quizzed on two of the most contentious issues of the campaign, free movement and membership of the single market, marginally more voters favoured the UK continuing without restrictions on migration in return for continuing to trade in the single market. A total of 42% of respondents said Britain should continue to allow EU citizens to live and work in Britain in return for access to the single market, including 18% of Leave voters. But 38% of those polled said losing access to the single market would be a price worth paying for new curbs on immigration. The overwhelming finding of the poll was that most voters are sticking to their positions. 83% of Remain voters now feel less hopeful for the future of the UK, compared to the 80% of Leave voters who are now more hopeful. Interviews with adults aged 18 to 75 across Great Britain were conducted online. Data are weighted to match the profile of the population, and to the estimated relative vote share of this group in the EU referendum.